Hey, what's up guys, it's BenBonk, and recently I entered the GMTK Game Jam 2022. If you somehow don't know, this is one of the biggest game jams of the year, where I have to make a game from scratch following a theme within 48 hours. For this jam, I'd be partnering with my friend Gizmote to make the music, and I was ready to get started. The day of the jam, I tuned in for the theme announcement on YouTube, and the theme was Roll of the Dice. This was a pretty neat theme in my opinion. There's lots of things you can interpret from it, such as obviously randomness, or you could take a more literal approach and have a dice or something else that you physically roll. So I hopped into Google Docs to draft out some ideas for the game, and I'll admit, I was pretty stuck. There's so much you can do with randomness and dice rolling that I just couldn't really settle on anything. Just over an hour passed from the theme announcement, and I had pretty much nothing. But I was talking to Gizmote, and he had an idea to make the dice be the player's weapon. Then, this gave me the idea for a top-down, high-score shooter game where a player would have a limited number of bullets based on a roll of their dice weapon. So, if they roll a 4, they get 4 bullets before having to respin and reload the weapon. But to make things interesting, I thought it'd be cool to have this roll also determine how long the player can move for. So again, if the player rolls a 4, they get 4 bullets and 2 seconds of move time, always totaling 6. This means the more bullets you get, the less movement you get, and vice versa, which I thought would hopefully create an interesting dynamic for the player, as they'd have to use their bullets and movement wisely. And then, once the player runs out of bullets and movement time, the weapon will automatically respin and reload. Now I know that might sound a little confusing already, but I'm not done just yet. On top of this mechanic, I thought of a slowdown mechanic where once a player reloads, time will slow down, and only resume once the player begins moving again. So the game is kind of just super hot. I don't know, I didn't really realize that at the time, but regardless, this sounded like a cool idea to me, so I got to work. First up, we need some player movement and a way for the player to shoot, as this is going to be a top-down shooter game. So I hopped into Unity and worked on a player movement and weapon script, which was pretty straightforward, and I ended up with this. Here, the player can move around and shoot little circles from a basic weapon. Now this is cool, but you may have noticed that where I'm clicking isn't where the bullets are shooting, which is really odd. So I messed around with some rotation stuff, and I don't even really know what I did to fix this if I'm being honest, but eventually I got things working. Now with these two systems created, it was time to create an enemy for the player to actually shoot. So I made this simple little red dude who can take damage and die after 3 hits. With this done, I wanted to start working on the core mechanic for the game, which was the bullets and movement time mechanic based on a die roll. So I got to work and created a simple function for a dice roll, just choosing a random number between 1 to 6, assigning this number to the weapon's bullet count, and giving 6 minus that number to the player's movement time. Then I had to make systems to give the player a limited number of bullets and allow the player to only move when they have move time. But eventually, I ended up with this. As you can see in the inspector, the player has 2 seconds of move time, which means they get 4 bullets to shoot. So now I can shoot 4 bullets and not be able to shoot any more. Then I can move for 2 seconds, see this variable decrease, and once these counts are both 0, the weapon will automatically reload. Now this was really cool, but right now our little red dude couldn't move. So I set up some simple A-star pathfinding for this enemy so that he can actually follow the player and path find. By now, this was a pretty good start for the core gameplay, so I got to work making some art for the game. First, I worked on this tile set. I wanted something kinda dungeony, as Gizmote and I liked the idea of making the main character a troll, so we could call the game Troll of the Dice. Very creative in relation to the theme, I know. But anyways, I created this tile set and then moved on to creating and animating the troll player. And honestly, I'm not too sure if this guy is really a troll. I guess trolls can differ greatly in appearance, but this guy kind of ended up looking like a garden gnome. Whatever, it's good enough for me, I guess. Next up, it was time to make some enemy art, and I had the ingenious idea of making the enemies be dice. I know, calm down, I'm a pretty out of the cube thinker. So we had these 3 different enemy sprites where the more difficult enemies would have higher numbers on top. Then I made the weapon art, which was just more dice that had numbers representing how many bullets the player would get. And finally, I made this simple projectile sprite for the weapon. Back in game, I set all this up and things were looking so much better. But the player's weapon still didn't display how many bullets the player rolled. So I whipped up this pretty neat reload animation when the player runs out of bullets and move time, which just spins the dice around, cycling through some random numbers, ending with the correct number of bullets. Then I worked on the slow motion effect for this reload, so that now when the player reloads, time will massively slow down, still allowing them to shoot, but once moving, time will resume to normal. With that finished, we had a lot of mechanics done, but not much visual clarity to represent these mechanics. So I started working on some UI for the bullets and move time, so the player could actually see how much more they have to shoot or move to trigger a reload. Eventually, I ended up with this, and as you can see, this UI is pretty straightforward and just displays the move time and bullets the player has. Moving on, it felt like time to work on the map for the game. So I made some additional inside wall sprites in A-Sprite and just made this massive room with a bunch of these wall obstacles inside for the arena. This was cool, but this arena was missing some enemies, so it was time to make an enemy spawner for the game. I wanted the enemy spawner to ramp up over time, so I made a kind of scuffed system to spawn more difficult enemies as time goes on and spawn enemies faster. So now, the game was already really starting to feel alive. And somehow I did all of this within the first working day of the jam, so I was feeling quite good. But this feeling would change as I went to bed and woke up the next day and realized that Unity deleted all of my game files for no reason. I was so pissed, and I'm just kidding, that didn't happen. But what did happen was I got started setting up the more difficult enemies in the game by giving them more health and a faster move speed. Then I worked on a score system, as this is a high score based game after all. Now, whenever the player kills an enemy, it'll give them 10 to 30 points depending on the enemy. And I added this kind of neat score animation that I thought looked pretty nice. Next, I realized that the game needed a health system for the player so they could actually take damage and die. So after a bit of programming, the player can now take damage if they touch an enemy. There's also some simple hearts UI in the top left so the player can take 3 hits before dying. And speaking of dying, I didn't have anything set up for when the player died, so I worked on a simple death screen that would slide up when the player ran out of health. This screen would display the player's score, as well as their high score, which I just set up using Unity's player pref system. And with this done, the game was really starting to feel complete, or at least the core game loop. So I got to work adding a bit of polish and wrapping up the game to get playtesting as soon as possible. To start off, I added a bit of post-processing to the game to lighten things up, and I really think this touch made the game pop compared to before. Next up, I created a basic start screen for the game, and as mentioned before, we named the game Troll of the Dice. This start screen would just allow the player to start the game or visit the tutorial. And for the tutorial, I wrote up a basic tutorial screen which just explained the game's mechanics by text. An interactive one would have definitely been better, but this is just what I had for now. So with those few things done, oddly enough, the game was sort of done, just 24 hours into the jam. This was a really weird feeling for me, because most of the time in game jams, I have to grind up to the last minute before the game jam ends to finish my game. But I wasn't just going to let this time go to waste, so I made a build of the game and uploaded it to itch.io to get some feedback on it so far. I sent the game over to my jam partner Gizmote for some feedback, and while I was waiting for him to get back to me, I decided to polish the game a tad more. First, I added these particle effects for when projectiles break, which already made the weapon feel so much more satisfying to use. And next, I created a bunch of little environment pieces to spice up the arena, as right now it was a little empty. And once adding these, the game felt much more alive to me. But now, Gizmote got back to me and he had a lot of really good feedback, so I hopped back into Unity to get to work. I started off by modifying the tutorial a bit to make things more clear, as well as renaming it to an instruction page, as it's not really hands-on. I also made a pause screen to allow the player to pause the game, and implemented the music and sound effects in the game made by Gizmote. If you want to listen to the soundtrack, just check out the game or click the link in the description. Finally, to finish up, I also got a lot of good feedback from a few of my Discord members who prompted me to add some particles for when enemies die and made me tweak my enemy spawning rates a bit, as well as the reload/slow motion effect speed to feel a bit faster. And for the final real change I made to the game, I made this system where occasionally a bomb would spawn and an arrow would point the player towards this bomb. Upon triggering, all enemies in the room would take 1 damage. This was just my way of trying to make movement a little more useful. I don't know if it helps too much, but hey, it's there. So with that mechanic added, that was the game pretty much done. I made this simple cover art in Photoshop and uploaded the game to itch.io. So if you want to play the game, the link is in the description. I'm pretty happy with this one, though I do wish I tried something a little more unique instead of just another top-down shooter. Anyways, that's the game I made for this jam, but if you want to make games yourself, check out the Unity game engine, who's actually sponsoring today's video. Unity is what I've been using for the past 4 years to make all my games, including this one. I really just love how intuitive it feels to make games with Unity, and there are literally thousands of YouTube videos and other resources to help you get started. Even some massive games have been made with Unity, such as Cuphead, Risk of Rain 2, Subnautica, Beat Saber, and the list goes on. So if you want to make a game, whether it be a 2D puzzle platformer or a 3D action parkour game, check out Unity. It probably won't be easy in the beginning, but spending time learning making games has been life-changing for me personally, and I'm really happy I started with Unity. Link in the description if you want to check it out. But yeah, that's the end of the video, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.